We're back out here once again, and today we're talking about some unintentionally bad advice you may be getting about your August bass fishing. What's the correct way to go about it, and how can you use this on your fishery? Stick around, we're going to talk all about it.
That's a bite. Ooh, that's a good one. Come on, don't you do it. Don't you do it. Don't you do it. That's a good one. Don't you do it. That's a good one. This one's coming home.
And here is this video's featured comment. Congratulations! If you would like to have a chance to have your comment featured in an upcoming video, all you've got to do is leave a comment. And now, on with the video. Welcome back to Lowbrow Fishing. And right now, as we move through the month of August and things really heat up, you're going to find an absolute plethora on YouTube of best baits for August videos, right? Seems like every YouTube angler has their list. Top 3 baits, top 5 baits, or whatever. And while these anglers may firmly believe in what they're talking about, sometimes it's unintentionally misleading. And there's a few reasons for that. A lot of times it won't apply to your fishery. You won't get the full effect, the full benefit of what they're talking about. And the reason for that is, well, there's 2 main forces right now that are driving what those bass are doing in the lakes on much of the northern hemisphere in the United States, all the way up to Michigan and Minnesota for a good section of the country. And the first thing is something we've talked about. We've been talking about it for the past few videos now, and that is those new of the year, those bait balls that those bass are absolutely gorging themselves on. Those bluegill and shiners and shad and even baby bass and alewife and goby and what have you. That's the focus of the bass's attention because it's easy. They open their mouth and they feed. There's very little effort. This is a prime time when those bass are going to gorge themselves. And it's really hard to pry those bass away from something that's so easy for them to focus on. Now, we've talked about throwing weightless flukes, and we've talked about throwing jerk baits just under the surface and how that works well for me. And something similar may work well for you. But the second thing is, and this is something that goes from August, September, and even into October in a lot of the deep south, and that's the thermocline. It's something we don't think about so much whenever we're fishing. Even in ponds, the thermocline is present, especially in a body of water that has no current. Now, we traditionally think of the thermocline as a layer below which there's no oxygen, so the bass treated as sort of a force field. Now, that's simplistically correct, but if you really want to understand what's going on, you need to understand exactly what the thermocline is and how the thermocline actually works. Now, what is it? It's a layer of oxygen, right? Well, no. The clue is in the name. It is a thermocline. It's heat-based. So you've got warm water on top and you've got colder water on the bottom. Now, in river systems and lakes that have a lot of current, you're not ever going to get much of a thermocline. And if you have a lot of rain like we just had here, it will cause that thermocline to dissipate because that colder water falling from the sky will cool down that top layer, which is called the epilimnion. And that's where all the photosynthesis takes place. This is what marine biologists call the epilimnion. And below that, you've got the area where the actual thermocline is, and that's the metalimnion. Now, water is stratified. In other words, it's broken down in layers, just like rock is. A geologist talks about the different layers or strata in rock. Well, a marine biologist does the same thing. There's different layers and strata in fluids, in liquids, such as the atmosphere and in our lakes and fisheries. So the thermocline is more based on heat than it is oxygen level. The oxygen is a consequence of that. But understanding the epilimnion, where all the photosynthesis takes place, we notice that's where all those bait balls are. So it works hand in hand. But I'm seeing guys fish these completely wrong. As an example, the last time I was out on the big lake fishing video for the last video about jerk baits, well, I saw a couple of young guys on a very fancy Ranger bass boat. They had all the bells and whistles. They had the 250 Merc. They had the power poles. They had all the electronics, including forward-facing sonar. But the problem is they were fishing around in one spot, doing a little bitty S loop, right? They'd fish over here and then fish over here, and that's where they stayed. The young man on the front of the deck, he was following those bass on his monitor. He was looking at them through live scope, and they saw me over to the side. I was back in a pocket, and they saw me over to the side chasing those busting bass and using a jerkbait to catch fish. Well, I talked to them later, and they were wondering why I was catching fish, but they were not. They felt like they were doing a lot of the same things that I was. And I told them, I said, "You're fishing too deep." I know, sacrilege, right? Fishing too deep in summer. Well, if the thermocline is higher up, you don't want to fish deep. And I see all these anglers talking about throwing deep diving cranks and even drop shots. A drop shot may not be one of the better presentations for you out deep. Might work better closer to the bank, but out deep, when people have a 2 or even 3 foot leader on their drop shot, if you're working 25, 30 feet of water and you're well below that thermocline, there's not going to be anything down there. So you're going to be chasing your tail all day. And don't get me wrong, old lowbrow likes to fish a deep diving crank. I mean, I'll start out with something like this little 5XD here, or maybe go out a little bit further with a 6XD. And if I really want to get deep, then I'll go with something like a Berkeley digger or a dredger, as they used to be called. This one goes to about 12. This one goes to about 15. And if I'm going to scrape bottom in the deepest part of the lake behind the dam, then I'm going to bring out this guy. This guy gets down over 22 feet, which usually gets me down deep enough. But right now, I'm not fishing a deep diving crank. And last year, you saw plenty of videos from myself and other anglers showing how a 6XD or other type of deep diving crank will work great when that water's hot, because those bass are going to go deep. But there has to be oxygen down there. You've got to have a good bit of current flow, or you need to have some rain to cool that water down and mix it up just a little bit. So no deep diving cranks and no drop shots or anything that's going to be on the bottom. This is something I know this is going to be a first on this channel, so brace yourselves. No jigs. I am not throwing anything like this 3/4 ounce football jig. And this is one of the ones that I made. These things are gorgeous and they work so well. And I love using them, and they catch me tons of bass, but not beneath that thermocline. I mean, I usually have something like a 3/4 ounce, or this fella right here. This is a 1 ounce when I really want to get down there and I really want to drag that deep bottom. But I'm not doing that right now. Right now, I'm staying closer to the surface. And even if I'm working topwater, I'm not working something like a walking bait, like a Zara spook or a one knocker spook or something like that. I'm trying to stay small. I will stay with a tiny buzz bait. I will stay with something like a head and torpedo, and I'm going to go with colors that are still going to mimic what those bass are feeding on. A bone color is great, or even a clear topwater bait. If you can find something like a little spook puppy, right? The little tiny spook puppies in a clear color, something like that may work. But pare down your sizes, be mindful of that thermocline. Notice how those bass interact with it. If you've got electronics, you can see that hard line. And a lot of times that hard line doesn't go below 8 or 10 feet. On the big lake, it tends to be relatively high because we have 110-degree weather, which is going to force that thermocline to develop very firmly. Now, below that, sure, the water will be cooler, but there's no oxygen for those bass to breathe. They've got to have oxygen just like we do. Only difference is theirs is dissolved in the water. And again, we've got thermocline that's forcing those bass up, and we've got those small balls of bait that are forcing those bass up. Work those two things together, hand in hand, and I'm telling you, that will impart on your bait selection. That will change your bait selection whenever you think of those two things together. And bass fishing in the summertime, even on hot bluebird skies days when there's very little wind, it can still be great. You can still catch a whole bunch of fish, some nice ones too. But You've got to focus on what's really going on. So whenever you listen to these videos, whenever you hear these guys talking about a deep diving crank, a great big heavy glide bait, you know, drop shots worked really deep, jigs worked really deep, all of these things, you have to think to yourself, how does that apply to my fishery? Even on something like a farm pond, especially on something like a farm pond when there's no water flowage at all, you're going to have a thermocline. So that's going to force those bass up and shallow. Vegetation provides a lot of oxygenation. So those bass are going to thrive there. So if you can find places that have a lot of oxygenation in the water, and if you can have a place that has a lot of cover, a lot of structure, or some shade for them, those are the places you want to target right now. And if you can find little balls of bait, or rather, if you can find big balls of bait with little fish in them, I'm telling you what, you can really put yourself on some very nice fish. Bass, while they're hard to chase down, they still have tendencies that we can use to find them and target them with the right presentation. Once you narrow those things down, I'm telling you what, summer bass fishing can really be a bonanza. So there you have it. Whenever you think about the bait those bass are chasing and the thermocline, when you put those two key elements together and use that to dictate a good part of your presentation, your catch rate will go through the roof. And you'll find that even though it's the dog days of summer, even though it's really hot, bass fishing in the summer months can be a bonanza. Thanks for watching Lowbrow Fishing. We'll catch you in the next one.